Hello and welcome back to another round on my YouTube channel focused on CI/CD. And today I'm fortunate to have Victor on the show, and we are together going to look at something that Victor talks about a lot. Victor, what do you talk about a
Well, I
lot?
talk about many things, so I'm guessing you mean Crossplane, but I talk about many things, so probably Crossplane and issues, what happens.
Cross-
Usually I talk about what happens after we pass the basics of something, including
yeah,
Crossplane.
Yeah, that's the stuff that I call day two problems because I'm in the fortunate situation that my team is introducing Crossplane and we're about to go to production, and that actually means that now I'm gonna see all of the problems that no one kind of talks about in all of those cool YouTube videos, and that is what I hope that we can touch on a little bit today. Thanks a lot for taking the time. But before we go into technical stuff and things that we're going to look at, I ask everyone to choose a sticker for my background because it's still not complete. I recently moved my home office, and I have two selections for you. Actually, I have four,
Okay.
right? Because it might be too easy. I have this one for you, which is obviously AWS branded because I get a lot of
Okay.
AWS swag. Uh, then I have some pizza. It also has some little bit of AWS
Okay.
branding. Then I have a sticker from the AWS Game Day because I like gamified learning a
Okay.
lot. And I have a fourth one, and a friend of mine has asked me to put this up for a while, and I didn't, which is also a pretty
That's not
fancy one.
fair to ask me to choose. Uh,
That's why I
yeah.
wanted to show you only three, but I
Yeah, kind
wanted
of
to
that,
go.
that one obviously, right? So
Okay,
let's say that it's a choice between the first three.
okay, let's do that. Which one do you
Pizza,
want to have?
definitely.
Yeah, great. That's what makes every meetup successful, and every developer wants that. I'm gonna put that in later after recording. So, Victor, I've been watching hundreds of your videos, maybe not hundreds, but
I mean, if you watch hundreds of my
learning a lot.
videos, I need to make a public apology to you, man, for all the pain I caused you.
That's true. You're making a lot of pain, and you're making a lot of trouble as well in terms of the challenges that you pose on some of the tools. But I think that you are collaborating on two different channels right now. One is the main one that I've been consuming a lot, which is the DevOps Toolkit, really focused on helping developers the way that I see that. But there's the other one, the DevOps Paradoxon, and I haven't really watched at that. So what's the story behind those two?
Yeah,
Tell me.
actually, the Devil's Paradox channel is the first one I started together with Darin, who is my ex-colleague from my previous company. And so that's the channel where he organizes most of the things. It's mostly podcasts or the Friday streams. I just appear there, so it's a relatively low involvement from my side. He does all the heavy lifting and so on and so forth. And then Devil's Toolkit is where I do the heavy lifting.
Ah, okay. And what makes you breath to spend, I guess, hours a week for that channel?
It's not only channel. It's simply most of what I do is public and focused on helping people one way or another. I've been working with open source for a long time, right? And YouTube is just one of the different ways I do that, right? But I'm involved in projects. I go to conferences often. Everything I do is public one way or another.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's why really that is also for you a possibility to share knowledge, which is also the stuff that drives
Yeah.
me, right? And yeah, first of all, thanks, because a lot of the stuff that you do is really helpful and a great learning opportunity for me and also people that work with the technologies that you talk about. And I'm sharing some of your videos within my organization as we moved on that journey. So it's great to have that, and to have that also available for kind of free for these people to consume.
It's not kind of free. It is free. You may see an ad or two
That
from
is that
YouTube.
is
That's true.
well, yeah. YouTube gets kind of all of my private data when
Yeah.
I watch videos. That's kind of a bad thing. So, but as we're posting this on YouTube, we shouldn't talk about that and complain too
Yeah.
much, right? Uh, so, as you maybe know, I'm kind of focused on CI/CD, but I'm kind of going a little bit into the direction of also looking at dev tools in general.
Mhm.
So, let's try to set the baseline a little bit on how do GitOps and CI/CD play together? How do they kind of breath together? Because a lot of the things that I get people to talk on about on my channel is having a standard CI/CD pipeline running in GitHub Actions, pushing something to AWS cloud providers, or even something to Kubernetes. How would you correlate that to each other?
So let me start by saying that we cannot compare those two because that would be comparing apples and oranges. CI/CD, at least in my head, those are the processes, right? The goal of CI is to make sure that we frequently validate our code changes and integrate them with changes of others, right? And CD would be all that plus we also deploy to production and do whatever else we need to do in production, right? So in my head, CI is a subset of CD, right? And both of them are processes, and those processes have perform certain actions. There are certain steps, certain things that need to be done for that process to be fulfilled, right? And GitOps is one of the steps, let's say, in that process, right? We need to somehow deploy our stuff somewhere, let's say production. Now, and usually people correlate and say, hey, CI, that's Jenkins or GitHub Actions or whatever, right? And I tend to see a very big difference between those things, right? CI or CD, that's a process. And Jenkins or GitHub Actions, what people normally call workflows or pipelines. I would define them as one-shot executors of something, meaning that you have some event, you do something, let's say push something to a code repository, and then you want to execute one or more things once and only once, and never again, right? I'm going to run tests once, only once for a given commit. I'm ignoring now the fact that some people have flaky tests and they run it a couple of more times until they work, and then I'm ignoring that, right? And you're going to build an image once, and so on and so forth. Now, we traditionally put deployments into that bucket as well, right? Hey, for every new release, I'm going to deploy it to production once. Now, the other type of activities we can do is state management, right? Or call it continuous state management. I'm not even using the word GitOps, right? Because there are many variations of the state management. And those processes are not happening once, they're continuous. That's more like a contract. Hey, I want to have this exact specification of this exact thing running over there, right? Whether that's application.
Deployed somewhere, delivered somewhere to a target.
But not
whatever.
only deliver it somewhere, but continue making sure that that something is there somewhere in that exact form, right? So it's something that starts with delivery, but it continues. It's a continuous, we call it drift detection and reconciliation, right? I'm continuously looking whether that something is the same as what you want. And if it's not, I'm going to do whatever needs to be done to make sure that it is. And those two are very opposing, very different types of activities, right? I want to execute this specific action, or I want to continuously manage the state of something. If you look at pods in Kubernetes, right? The Kubernetes is a state management machine in a way, right? If you say I want 3 pods, you shut down 2 of those pods, 2 will be recreated, right? Because you said 3, and I'm continuously making sure that your desires are fulfilled.
You get what you want. Yeah, exactly.
So Kubernetes is that, and GitOps is also, you can think of GitOps as being a subset of the state management, right? It's a bit more specific. Hey, the desired state, what you want is in Git, and the actual state, and this is where people make a mistake. We don't know where the actual state is, right? Because the actual state is that deployment that you define in Git will be in Kubernetes cluster, but the actual state is really containers running in that cluster. It's not the deployment itself, right? So it's a bit more than that. But anyways, in a more simplistic way, it's, hey, I this is what I want, this is what I get. What I want is in Git, and what I get is in Kubernetes cluster, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. So at the end, that's the approach of state management that kind of there's tools that solve that for us, Flux, Argo, whatever, right? And they are primarily focused on the Kubernetes space, right? Now, before I ask the next question, let's try to talk let's make sure that this conversation, we assume that everybody kind of knows what Crossplane is. I'm gonna try to explain that with my words, and then you can correct me whether that's a good or a bad or
Okay.
right approach, right? The way that I look at Crossplane, it's a declarative infrastructure as code tool that helps me to keep my desired state in sync with my custom compositions, or maybe not custom compositions, that I kind of apply to a Kubernetes API. So Crossplane does the magic to translate what I want to get into infrastructure, and this spans across Kubernetes and also cloud resources in general.
The only correction I would make, and probably what you said is actually in the official documentation, and I disagree with it greatly, and that's that it's not necessarily about infrastructure. I think that's limiting. I would say to manage resources, right? And that those resources can be infrastructure,
Yeah.
can be applications, can be many different things, right? To manage resources somehow, yes.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, that's you're right with that. A Crossplane, of course, is more than just just infrastructure at the end, right? It also can power application deployments and these kind of things. And of course, I forgot about that, but you're right. Okay, so assuming everyone knows that about Crossplane, now how do we map a traditional CI/CD approach, which kind of was, I have something that I'm working on that is now in a development environment. Now I want to see this in a staging, and now I want to see this in a production environment. What's your take on mapping this in a GitOps world, which assumes to use Crossplane?
I mean, from the GitOps perspective, it's the same as anything else you would do using, let's say, Argo CD or Flux, right? If you're talking about GitOps, you have typically. So actually, let me backtrack a second. Imagine that there is no Crossplane. Typically, you would have base manifests somewhere, and then you would have Argo CD, let's say, application manifest that says, "Hey, that's where the manifests are," and overwrite those few values because they're specific to this environment. So let's say in staging, the host should be staging.acme.com, and in production, I'm going to use exactly the same manifests, but overwrite the host to be acme.com, right? So you would have base plus as many references to that base with all values that are written in as many environments you have, right? And you can do that with Crossplane, but not necessarily. You don't necessarily have to, because what we would normally consider base manifests, a Helm chart with deployment and service and ingress and this and that, can live inside of a cluster, right? So your compositions are inside of the cluster, and instead of having hundreds or thousands of lines of YAML that define everything you need, you just simplify it with a typically people have 10, 20, 30 lines of YAML, right? And then you don't even need those base manifests because we use base manifests not to repeat ourselves too much, but since actually we reduce it to very small number of lines, when I'm talking about claims now, then you can just skip those base manifests and have claim number one here for staging, claim number two for production. They're exactly the same, except that this value is different, right? Basically, it would be almost as if you put a Helm chart inside of a cluster, right? Instead of in a different Git repo.
Yes, but it always assumes that someone manually puts it in there, or not. So claims, the way that I see it, are you ask for something to be provisioned by Crossplane, you put that somewhere, you define the values that you need, and now Crossplane is going to do its magic. Now, while this is, from my perspective, is fine for a general setup, right? If I'm looking at this from an enterprise perspective, I want to pass these different claims through different environments in an automated fashion. How do you do that?
You would deploy that or apply that claim to, let's say, staging, and then you would apply a variation of the claim, let's say with a different, let's say that you want a database to have a database, and in staging you would have the value size set to small, and then in production to large, right? You would have now whether you use, let's say, YQ to modify that file and push it to Git or something like that, but you would basically.
Okay, yeah, so that's what I'm getting at. Like, you need to kind of implement that around Crossplane or around the tools itself. You need to implement that process.
Oh,
right?
It would be
That
similar
yeah,
to, let's
okay,
say, imagine that you're using a Helm chart for an application. You wouldn't have two charts for different environments. You would have one chart, but then you would have two values files, right? And then you would be modifying those
yeah,
values files depending on which environment you're in, right? And pushing it to Git. Same thing, just that
yeah,
in this case, claim is closer to a values file than the chart itself, right? Chart is
yeah.
so
That makes sense.
normally
Yeah.
in my pipelines, I tend to use GitHub Actions a lot. In my pipelines, I would just do
Mhm.
YQ.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, it makes sense, and that's essentially what I've seen in the world as well, right? To solve that challenge, you can obviously also automate that with other tools, but somehow you need to put in that claim in an
Oh yeah,
automated fashion. Now, you just said something that so I have a that I don't really like about Crossplane, and we can talk about it why. I have a background on AWS, and I kind of Crossplane is one of the first exposures for myself regarding Kubernetes and stuff like that, which is pretty funny.
you're one of the very few. Typically, it's the other way around. I've been using Kubernetes for a long time.
I
Yeah,
know, and that's why my question is, why the hell do I need that stupid Kubernetes cluster to use Crossplane?
because there are quite a few reasons. First is because you can interact with something through an API, which might not sound like a difference, but it is a huge difference than just assembling your shell scripts or
Yeah.
files of this kind of that kind and modifying them and so on and so forth. You're interacting with an API, and that's a model that you're using AWS, right? That's what AWS also tells you, right? Kind of like you talk with me through an API, whether that is through CloudFormation or Terraform or this tool or whatever. I'm giving you an API. Now,
Yep.
majority of Crossplane users, a significant number of Crossplane users, are people who are not the end users, or people who are building services for the rest of the people in their company, right? And they
Mhm.
want that same experience. I don't want to give a bunch of files to developers and what's not. I want to give them API. You interact with that API, and magic will happen, right? Just as operations people do with AWS. Even though many are not even aware, kind of, oh, I use Terraform, I don't use API. No, you're using API. You just don't know.
You are using
Exactly.
APIs. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
So, and API alone is already a reason good enough for something to be built on top of Kubernetes, because it's standard, it's designed to be extensible, and so on and so forth, right? If you would start building it from scratch, hey, Johannes, build your own implementation of extensible API that can be anything that anybody ever wants, depending on what they choose, you would just waste years of your life for no good reason, right? Kubernetes gives you that out of the box. It's designed to do that. We have custom resource definitions and so on and so forth, and controllers. Then
Yeah.
there is, and I'm now talking only about the advantages of what Kubernetes gives you as a person who builds a project on top of it out of the box, right? So that you don't waste your time. There is
Yeah.
drift detection, right? There is a mechanism that tells you, hey, this is the difference, right? There is a reconciliation, like what Kubernetes does with pods. And my favorite, there is the ecosystem. So let's say that you want to create a similar tool today, right? You would need to figure out not only what the core business of the tool is, but okay, how do we ship logs? You need to do it yourself, right? You cannot rely on other tools that
True.
did not build it for you. How do we observe that, metrics, this or that, right? And if it's Kubernetes native, then you say, I don't need to worry about those things. I don't need to, we don't, Crossplane project, we don't need to figure out how people will deploy our stuff, because they can use Argo CD or Flux. We don't need to figure out policies, because people can use Caverno. We don't need to figure out and so on. There is a massive list of things, because we're all building on top of a standard, Kubernetes, and whomever builds on top of that standard is interoperable with anybody else.
Yeah. And I think that is true. That gives a lot of possibilities and flexibilities. From coming from the other side of the world, where things are very opinionated, or maybe not as opinionated as we would want to, right? But coming from being tied to one of the cloud providers, what I see on the Kubernetes space is too many options, too many
Yes,
difficult decisions that need to be taken for that, right? And so that is challenging me personally
it's
from
horrible.
time to time, right?
I mean, if you look at the
And
CNCF landscape page, you probably saw it, right? You say, what the
Of
heck,
course.
man? Kind of like, this makes no sense. This is silly, right? Kubernetes has a lot of choices, and that's both a good and a bad thing, depending on which point of time you look at it, right?
That is true.
When something is being and remember, Kubernetes is only 10 years old. Kind of, it sounds like it's been there forever. 10 years is not that much, right? We want a lot of choices because and when I say we now, I'm not talking about we as Crossplane, but Kubernetes community, right? So that
Yeah.
different ideas are competing with each other, and through that competition, in a way, trying to figure out what is the best path forward for a given problem. Now, Kubernetes is already is, I feel, in a different phase than it was before, right? Now we're in reconciliation phase, or we are on
Yeah.
consolidation phase, actually.
Consolidation is the right way, and I hope that. Well, I don't know if I hope, but I see that a little bit, kind of still being outside the Kubernetes community or coming into it. I see that consolidation, and I think it's going to be challenging a lot of the vendors that we have today and a
Oh
lot
yeah.
of the projects that we have as well in the next weeks and months. But
Look at
um,
OpenTelemetry as an example, right? We had infinite number of observability providers, tools, what's or not, and they were all either willingly or unwillingly, not always willingly, forced to comply to the standard we call today OpenTelemetry, right?
yeah,
Cilium, for example, became the de facto standard of sorts for networking, right? And before you had to think, oh, is it going to be this or that kind of? You had 57 choices. You still have 57 choices, just to be clear. But we are all converging towards, okay, so networking is going to be most likely Cilium, right? Telemetry is going to be OpenTelemetry, so on and so forth. So we're getting there. We're not even close. So it will take at least 5 more years, and it will never be 100%. But we're getting to the phase that there are some de facto choices.
yeah, and I think that's a good thing. At the same time, I think that the ecosystem needs to do a little bit more work in guiding guiding end users on what the right thing is going to be, right? And I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the next few weeks and months. But let's go back to Crossplane, right? And let's look a little bit into what are challenges that I see today. We also, I think, we prepared a little bit of a demo. Before we go into demo, something that kind of is always going around is Terraform is cloud agnostic. Everyone says that. People say Crossplane is cloud agnostic. Now, when I look under the hood, yes, Crossplane can deliver multiple cloud providers, but I'm still searching for an abstraction level for, let's call it an EC2 instance that can spin across instances across different cloud providers. Victor, do you know any tool that does that already based on Crossplane for us?
So let me answer that first without Crossplane, right? There were attempts in the past, and actually even Terraform in very, very early days tried to create abstractions of that kind and say, okay, so if you want a VM, these are all the options you can choose for your VMs, and they can be running in Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, or whatever, right? And that always failed simply because the only way to make something cloud agnostic from the vendor perspective is to go for the lowest common denominator, right? It's
True.
okay. So what are all the options available in all big three or four or five, depending on how you count? And that's what you have. And then you as a consumer, you say, no, but I need this specific feature of AWS, right? And that's when it blows up, right? I don't think that we will have ever something that is cloud agnostic on that level by vendors.
Do you see software develop? So well, do you see in? Oh, come on, let's try again. Do you see corporations that build on top of Crossplane aiming to be multi-cloud or to be cloud agnostic, or haven't you seen that yet
Not
in the
that
wild?
much collaborations, more that within a company, within an organization that uses Crossplane, they're making themselves cloud agnostic, right?
Mhm.
And it might sound that I'm saying the same thing, but it's very different, right? Because within an organization, so let's say you have an organization that chose AWS and Azure, they're using those two providers, right? And they're already independent of the tooling, they're having, let's say, Kubernetes cluster running in both of those, and they know what are the best practices for themselves. They chose the options that they like and they ignore the rest. And then they can they have those best practices that couldn't be dictated by somebody outside of them, and then they can create abstractions for their employees that say, okay, so you need to specify whether it's in Azure or AWS, and you need to specify region and few other things, and behind the scenes it will be completely different what will happen, right? But the abstractions can be the same. But I'm very skeptical that a vendor could create those abstractions because of that lowest common denominator, right? But you can, right? Because if you're using two, you can say, yeah, I'm going to make two completely different things, but expose it to my developers in the same way.
Yeah, exactly. And that gives the developers then the possibility to not know about the
Yes.
implementation details. And in an ideal world, we also manage that, let's say, Johannes requests a compute instance, and that compute instance will today be on Azure, will tomorrow be on EC2, and will the day after be on GCP, and Johannes will not
Yes.
even notice. And I think so. That's something that I don't know if we have a demo prepared on how to do that, but that would be great to look at how do we actually achieve that.
Yeah.
So
Let me see. How do I share my screen?
That's what I wanted to say. This is a new tool for the recording. I never tried this yet, so I don't know how it works.
It will happen. You should see my screen now, right?
I can see your screen. Amazing.
I prepared the demo that will actually not meant to show what we're asking now, but more than enough to show. So here's an example of examples AWS. Okay, this one. So let's say that I want a database, right? And now my database is in AWS would be, in both cases, I want PostgreSQL database. In AWS, that would be RDS, and in Google Cloud, it would be whatever they offer, and in Azure, whatever they offer, right? And very completely different implementations. And remind me if you want, I can show you the implementation itself. But now from the user perspective, my developers in my organization, they don't care about any of those things, right? They care about, I want Postgres. Here we go, right? I want this version. I want it to be bigger than small, smaller than big, right? I didn't even, I'm not entering here in this example. And again, you can create this anyway. I'm not entering, is it E2 something something or T3 something something. I don't know those things, right?
Doesn't matter.
This is the region where I want to run. And in that database server, I want to have those two databases, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
sounds like a straightforward API call, essentially.
And there are labels. So behind the scenes, there is something we call composition that will figure out and create all the AWS resources or Azure resources or whatever you're using, right? And since there are multiple compositions, implementations tied to this interface, in this case, I'm using labels to say, hey, I want all that to have a label provider, AWS, and database PostgreSQL, right? Because I have implementations for Azure, and I might have implementations for MySQL, right?
So in this case, you're giving the choice to the user that it's going to be on AWS, right? You're not abstracting that away. And that means now the user can kind of say that needs to be there, and the composition will react on those labels and take the decision on what infrastructure to provision at the end.
Exactly. So now I'm going to do kubectl apply. Kids, don't do this at home. Use Argo CD or Flux. I was just too lazy to install it for the demo, right? And it's kind of a bit faster and easier to see what's going on. But don't do it. Don't do this at home. Namespace infra, and I'm going to apply whatever I defined there, which is examples, and then it was this one, right? So I'm going to basically, and this is going back to the previous conversation about APIs. I'm using kubectl. Somebody could do it through the web UI. Somebody else could do it in any other way. I'm sending basically the desired state to Kubernetes API, one way or another, right? And that was created, right? And from now on, I will show you two different experiences: one for the developer or the user of this service, and the other one for service builder, right? Kind of the person who assembled it all.
Yeah. So now before I go into that piece, something that makes me nervous is the moment that I apply this API, I now need to trust Crossplane to do its magic. And that level of trust is something that for me is sometimes very hard.
Yes.
Right.
It's I wouldn't say that this is specific question to Crossplane, but I think that this question can be applied to Kubernetes in general, right?
Correct.
Because
Yes.
basically, essentially, everything you do in Kubernetes is going to have the same level of fear. You're going to create a deployment, and you will have no idea at which point your application will be running, because deployment will create a replica set will create any number of pods, or maybe it will not create any of the pods, or maybe it will fail to create pods, and then it will be able to create pods 5 minutes later, right? It's events of consistency, right? And that's very scary, at least, and it's in a way, it's very different from automation that I'm going to use as an example, but in some ways are similar. If you remember, like, that was not happening today that much, but in the past, kind of, we want to automate our tests, but we don't trust them enough. We still need humans to do exactly the same thing because we don't trust it, right? And we were passing through many different phases of, this is very scary, I don't trust it, and that's okay. Because over time you start to learn to trust it. And many people now trust Kubernetes to do the right thing with pods.
That is true.
It just takes a bit of time. And it's not a good choice for everybody, just to be clear, right? It's basically, it's saying, I'm delegating part of my job as a human to a machine. Before, I would be watching like this and say, okay, is it finished? Is it finished? Is it finished? Is it running? And eventually it will be running. Now you're delegating to Kubernetes and saying, I trust that you will do the right thing. And this important thing, I trust myself to have good observability tools to let me know when you don't, because it will not do the right thing always.
Yeah, so spotting in this claim other region doesn't seem like an AWS region.
Oh, no, it's not. It's not. This is going to fail big time.
Okay.
Because I wanted to show you day
Really?
two operations. That's why I did it, right?
Yeah, then let's have a look, because it actually looks like it worked. So how would we now trace that?
And this is now the problem that we have in Kubernetes for people who are not very familiar with Kubernetes, right? And that's that, one, you create something and Kubernetes might expand that something into something else, and that something else might become something else. Like, you create a deployment creates a replica set creates pods. Now, if in this scenario, imagine, right? There is something wrong with the pods, but you created the deployment. Will you see in deployment that there's something wrong? No, you will not see that there is something wrong. You will need to be experienced with Kubernetes enough to check the pods themselves to see whether it's wrong. If you check the deployment, which is your interface, you will see everything being great, right?
Yes.
And same thing here. I created something called a SQL claim, and it says not ready, which is kind of okay, because it could take a few more minutes until things are created in AWS, or it might be terribly wrong. We don't know. And if we take a look at, if we describe this now as a developer, if you describe this, it seems everything is okay, right? Composite resource is not yet ready. It says here, I just realized that actually I set up a wrong demo. Imagine that you're not seeing this, what you're seeing here. I'll show you later.
Okay.
There we go. Imagine that what's in yellow says everything is okay. Now, from operational.
Now, the resource is still not available at the end, right? So the resources has not yet been created, and that's okay, because Kubernetes API is going to do its magic. Eventually.
And if you look at this is what you would see as operator, right? This is more like person who created this claim might not be interested in this, but this is basically, hey, this claim created.
So the person that built the composition might now be interested in seeing why this is not being provisioned, which is why with beta trace you can now get more details around the
Yeah, basically
corresponding
you can see
resources,
what
right?
created what. Like this is what you
Okay.
created, and this is what you're interested as a developer. But then
Mhm.
behind the scenes, that created a composition, and composition created internet gateway and main route table and a couple of route table associations and route tables and routes and a bunch of things, right? Things that
Mhm.
this is now things that you need to be not only a Kubernetes expert, but also you need to know AWS in details, because vast majority of people are, hey, I want a database. What's over there? Like, don't give me that madness, right?
Could be so much simpler, right? It could be so much simpler.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And now imagine that you haven't seen what. Now, one thing that is a bit problematic in Kubernetes and that we are trying to solve now in Crossplane specific is that there is no propagation of, if a deployment creates a replica set creates pods. You need to look at the pods. You cannot look at the deployment to know what's going on.
Mhm.
Now, we
Yeah.
are now working, this is in very early stages, in a way that when you're designing your services, you can choose which information and in which form should be propagated all the way back.
So you see that at the
Yeah.
top. Okay.
So if I go back to, if you actually imagine that I didn't make a mistake in the setup and show you back again, imagine that, yeah, actually no need to imagine. If I show you back here, you will see here the information. So this is in Kubernetes, this is status, right? If you
Mhm.
would use some web UI, you would get the pretty things with pretty colors and stuff like that, right? Many different ways to visualize it.
Doesn't matter. Yeah.
What
Yeah.
does matter is that there is this message for the developer, specifically made for the developer, says provider config is missing. And more
Mhm.
importantly, it says context service owner, meaning that this is not a problem that you can fix. Imagine that this would be equivalent of, there are two types of problems when you work with AWS. There are problems that you can fix. There are problems that you cannot. Like the whole region went down.
True.
That's
Yes.
contact AWS. There is nothing in the world you can do.
You can't fix that. Yeah,
So,
exactly.
and this message, whomever designed this composition, designed under which conditions this message
Mhm.
should appear, right? And
Mhm.
now imagine that that
In this case, you are the service owner and you now need to fix the provider config, which will then enable the system to be
yeah,
able to
I
deploy
just
stuff again,
in this
right?
scenario
So,
I just
okay.
did not give Crossplane credentials to connect to AWS, right?
Yeah, that's okay.
And
Yeah.
now I got that email or Slack notification or Jira ticket as an operator, as the owner. I'm going to fix it right away. And if we now, it may take a while until you see the results of this, simply because Crossplane has a reconciliation loops that are not every second, but
Yeah, we can use the wait time to talk about that, because to be honest, that reconciliation loop, if you work with cloud
mhm.
providers, results in a lot of API calls, and this then at the end results
Yes,
in, if you are working in a organization that is security focused, it can result in a lot of high costs on the security tools that actually monitor and scan those API calls that are being monitored by the security tools.
yes. So what you can do is you can change the frequency of those API calls, right?
Mhm.
And you need to figure out what is the right balance for you. Now, the more frequent it is, the sooner it will detect the problem and fix it. But then more requests is going to AWS in this case, or you can delay it and say, hey, actually, every 15 minutes or 1 hour is okay for me, right? Because remember, you don't have this with other tools anyway, so you're not losing anything. It's just a question of
True.
how much of it you want and how much, it's a cost
So,
optimization.
to translate that for the audience, kind of what I'm hearing is we have the possibility to define how often does Crossplane verify the state with the target cloud provider and or with also the Kubernetes API. Kind of the reconciliation time frame is
Yes,
what I kind of can define, and that will then result to Crossplane do the magic and fix things to bring the state to the target cloud provider on a regular
exactly.
basis. Now, the defaults I think is like 1 minute or even smaller than that, or 10 seconds. So if my experience is, if you go go take Crossplane, deploy it somewhere, and go with the defaults, it can get very costly if you're not paying
so
attention.
there are many things that affect it. For example, if you just create it, it will be instant, right? And then it will start looping afterwards. And initially, the frequency is higher, and then it slows down. So first time, I'm inventing a bit numbers, so don't take this as exact numbers. But first time, oh, I cannot do this right now. Let me try in 5 seconds, and then 10 seconds, 15 seconds, up to a minute. I'm not sure the exact default limit, and then from there on, that's the frequency. Let's say 1 minute or something like that.
Yeah, the exponential back off is that you're using over there, right? And I think it has been kind of now moved to 10 minutes or something like that, is what I saw in one of the PRs.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So, and
So,
you can disable it altogether. But I never heard of anybody disabling. I know people who do put the higher value, the frequency to higher value.
okay, so let's see if the provider config apply that we
Yeah.
did has fixed the issue. Okay, this looks
Exactly.
different.
This is now, and those are all custom messages, right? This does not come out of the box from Crossplane in any form or way. This is now, okay, you know the problem before? I fixed it for you. Now it's back in your hands as a developer. And this is now saying, hey, selected region, other region is not available. Double check this field, service spec parameters region value, right? So this is now a message from the service owner, let's say, to you as the user. Hey, you messed it up. Now don't call me. If you send me an email, you'll be fired. Type of stuff. You can fix it yourself, right? And if we, let's say that I now fixed it, I have already the fix, right? This is exactly the same manifest as before. I just changed to US East 1.
With a normal region at
Exactly.
the end.
And now if I do apply file name, and I'm going to put namespace to, what was it, infra, I think. There we go.
Infra, yeah.
Now it will eventually work, right? When I say eventually, again, depends on that. Now actually this should be instant. Yeah, because now that I updated it, it's not waiting until the next time the timeout comes, the loop. It's trying to apply again. And now it says, hey, the status is true. From a developer perspective, you're fine. This is the message to ease you up. Just now it's just about patience, right? Now this message can change in the future, because now it might be creating subnets and VPCs, and then it might wait until it creates RDS, and then it might see that something is wrong. So it might change, but so far so good, right?
So far it looks good and it's working
Exactly.
its way, right? So now you said all of these messages are custom, is what you
so
said? Right?
Those are custom, right? So now if I do kubectl get managed, right? Those are each of those resources have their own baked in statuses and messages, and I'm doing this, I'm doing that, right? It's just that the logic is, if I send all the information back to the developer, that person will be equally overwhelmed as if not using that abstraction, right? So it's the ability to pick and choose. What
sense.
I can show you the code actually if you want. This is gonna be a bit tricky, a bit overwhelming maybe, but compose. Let me see here, right? Basically, it's this one saying, hey, if let me see, okay, matches. Let's say this one, right? Hey, look at this example is from Azure, but the same logic, right? Look at resource group, and if the status is, if you see the resource group object or resource itself, and the status says false, and if the reason is reconcile error, and if you see this message inside of that specific resource, then propagate it back to the claim with this message, right? And you can use regular expressions, you can inject values, you can propagate the message as is, you can change it, you can make a completely new one. You're basically saying, hey, if you see this specific conditions, this specific situation happening, then ignore it. And if you see this, then
Okay.
propagate this message to developers, right?
Okay, so what that means is that essentially building out the right error messages for the user is part of writing a good composition.
Correct.
And I think that's something that I think not everyone directly understands, right? Building that composition is those compositions is the magic of Crossplane, and building them in a way that they are consumable by developers is key to be successful with adopting that. I think that's the way I see it.
Because this thing, being able to write this simple interface, to me that's absolutely necessary. But that's day zero. Kind of, okay, I can enable developers to, in this case, to create a database. And in most other solutions I've seen is, and if something goes wrong, then you better be religious to pray to your deity of choice, because there is nothing you can do, right? Because either you have no information or you're overwhelmed with information. It's one of the two. Sometimes we give you all the, imagine that we now give to this developer all the logs from AWS. If that person knows what that means, that person wouldn't need abstraction in the first place.
That is
Nothing
correct.
is equally bad, right? So
yeah, that is true. So essentially that means if you kind of, so there's different perspectives on in all of this, right? The user that is applying this claim might just need to do kubectl describe to understand what the error message is.
And of the resource
the
that
only
they
possibility.
created, not the sub resources, not the sub resources, not the whole tree of it. Just I created this claim. I just want to see from this claim what's wrong. Don't give me the subnets, VPCs, and all that nonsense, right?
Okay. Now, if we did that, right? So now, kind of that the consumer of that API says, "I'm done. I can't solve this." If this goes to the operator, what are the next steps that guy is going to do? It's going to look at Crossplane beta trace, and then it's going to look at log files, or what is the
operator
approach
would
that you're
probably
taking?
do something like, let's say, hey, these are all the resources created from this. Let's say that for the sake of argument, this object is not working. In this case, it's normal that it's not working, but I'm now simulating, and I would describe this specific object and see, oh, okay, this is the problem. I need to do this or that, right? Or you can also do kube managed, right? The operator or the owner would need to go into low-level details, right? Those are, from the perspective of developer, all this are low-level details, right? So
True.
If I would use the example of AWS, a person in AWS, operator over there, would need to deal with problems of a hypervisor, right? And I, as a user of AWS, I don't want to ever see the hypervisor. I just want to see the problems of mistakes I made when I create EC2 instances, right? So there is what I think that we should all be thinking, no matter the technology and the tools we're using, if we want to be service provider for internal services, we need to figure out what is the line, where do I come in, and up to which point you are self-sufficient. And the conclusion could be only day zero, maybe, right? Maybe not. That's a question that each of us needs to answer separately.
Yes, I think that's more a process and an ownership question that you need to solve within your organization if you want to go that route, right? Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. From a demo perspective, what else did we plan to look at, Victor? Don't want to put you on the spot.
No,
to be honest.
that's the short version of it. I can go into more details of specific resources, but the gist is that kind of. I think that the point is that as an operator, you can create what we call compositions, and that would be this one, right? This is everything that I had to define to enable the databases in the three providers, right? And actually, I just reached the limit of how much I can scroll in my terminal. So there's much more, right? This is complex stuff, right?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the main challenges that I've been seeing in the past few months and working with Crossplane. Building compositions is really hard, and the developer tooling that we have today is, well, I don't like YAML. Which is why it's
this thing that is just released, so I'm still using it as YAML. There is no YAML here. This is not YAML.
Those are all Go templates.
In this specific case, it's KCL. I'm a person who likes using
KCL.
KCL.
Okay. Okay. Good.
Here's a background story. For a long time, people have been bugging us to add additional features to Crossplane compositions. Hey, I want conditionals. I want loops. I want this. I want that, right? And we rejected all those because we did not want,
Because you're mean,
we're
right?
evil. I mean, I'm mean in my company, but other people are actually nice. So because there is that danger that I think that many tools fall into starting as something simple or not simple, but making it more complicated over time. Because if you try to fulfill everybody's desire, then there is a danger of nobody getting what they want in a way, right? Everybody gets
True.
everybody's desires, and then it's a mess. So we decided actually to keep the composition schema very relatively simple. Kind of those are the things you can do. There are no banks and whistles, but you can use functions, meaning, and we don't care what the function is. It can be anything. It can be, in this case, it's KCL. In your case, it could be Go, it could be Java, it could be XML, whatever you want. We just expect you to tell us, hey, where is the function, so that Crossplane can send the list of currently assembled resources to that function. That function does whatever you want, as long as it outputs resources back, right? So you can define, you can run it in, I don't know, what's your favorite language, whatever it is. You can run a function and assemble it over there. Crossplane will just call you and say, give me the data.
Can I externalize that? So here we have that within the composition YAML, right? Now the next step from a developer experience perspective would be having a build compositions project within your IDE, right? Where you would then have just a YAML that refers to the relevant Go files, because that would, or the relevant KCL files, or the relevant Java files, or TypeScript, whatever, right? Because that would then give me back the compiler support for that, right?
Actually, this is my source code. There is not a single YAML there. It's just that in my case, I'm using KCL to assemble all the shenanigans and so on and so forth, right? You can use whatever you want. Now, the problem is still that, there are two stories over there, right? We as Crossplane community, we've been focused on, hey, how can we follow all the all the Kubernetes best practices and norms and standards to do things. Crossplane is following them very, very closely, right? And most of the time, the complaints about Crossplane are actually complaints about Kubernetes in general, right? Kind of, this is just bad, right? And I'm blaming Crossplane because I'm kind of interacting with it right now. But if I dig a bit deeper, kind of, that's basically the situation in Kubernetes itself. Now, from the company perspective, and that's probably going to, we are a Kubernetes project, that's going to stay like that. Now, from company perspective as Upbound, in the past, we were focusing very much on very advanced users. Kind of, I have such a big system that I need 10 or 100 control planes running with Crossplane doing stuff. Now we're changing that stays the focus, but now we're opening a second path, which is focusing more on developer experience. So you will see probably around KubeCon a much easier way to write, support for VS Code, some web UI, and kind of things that will help people from day one. While in the past, as a company, it was, okay, if you are a Crossplane user and if you're very experienced in Kubernetes and so on and so forth, we can take it to the next level. If you do the first 57 steps, we can help you with the 58. Now we're trying to kind of, we can help you from the day one in a way.
Kind of to reach up the day one users, right, and be able to reach out to them. Now, is this stuff being open source that you just talked about, or is this mainly closed source?
I don't know
right
yet.
now,
It will be under. So it will not be under Crossplane project CNCF. It will be part of Unbound offering. Now, I'm not sure how much it will be code visible or not. I'm not sure we made that decision just yet.
Yeah, and I think it doesn't matter as long as we improve developer experience over there, right? So I think another question that I brought into this conversation is sometimes you have cloud resources that kind of just live there and that don't go away because of certain things. How do you solve that problem? I think Crossplane has some concept of finalizers. Maybe we can use that as an, or is that an algorithm term? I don't know. Let's talk about
finalizers. That's actually Kubernetes itself as well. Basically, that's a way in Kubernetes to say, hey, you cannot delete this thing yourself. This thing needs to be removed by this resource, right? Theoretically, you could put a finalizer in pod, even though it's not there, and say, hey, this pod is controlled by replica set. You don't want to mess with it directly, right? And that makes a lot of sense because it's ownership. This resource owns that resource. If you start messing with it directly, bad things might happen, right? Yeah. And I need to backtrack for a second again. I do that all the time. Sorry for that. So we had complaints in the past that, hey, when creating resources, I cannot control what happens when, which is mostly perceived or imaginary problem because Kubernetes works in a very different way. Kind of, you don't need to order when things will be created. It's simply, oh, I can do this, I cannot do this. I'll try again later. And eventually you will be able to do this, right? It's not so linear as non-Kubernetes tools. And you can delete anything you want, and then the children resources will be deleted. If I delete this claim, it will delete all the resources, and you will have no problem that you mentioned, except when resources cannot be reached, when the real actual resources cannot be deleted. So here's an example. Let's say that I have a database server here, RDS, and I have a database inside of that server. Let's say that those are the only two things I have. If I delete the claim, it will try to delete both the server and the database. But now imagine that for whatever reason, the server is deleted first. And then it goes and says, hey, goes to the API of AWS, says, I want to delete this database. And AWS says, no, you cannot do this. It's impossible because the RDS doesn't exist, right? I'm simply not going to even talk to you, right? Or if you created a Kubernetes cluster and installed something in that cluster, and cluster is removed before you uninstall it. So the problem is when you remove things that you might want to have a special order with that. And I think like a year ago, we introduced something called usage. So you can say this resource uses that resource. Crossplane, you don't know about it, but I'm telling you now that this database uses this server. So better delete the database first before you delete the server. So that's called usage, and it's baked into. No, actually, right now, so we're following Kubernetes logic, and alpha versions are not enabled by default, and that's alpha. You would need to enable it when you install Crossplane.
Okay, but then we could directly define that usage, and that would then make it easier to
then it would know, hey,
be aware of those.
Don't think about removing this thing until you remove that thing.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah. I have two more things I wanted to bring up. First one is, let's assume I have an RDS database that is created by Terraform, and that's because the database team owns that. But I still want to be able to create the database on top of that with Crossplane. Is there an approach to import existing AWS or cloud provider resources in general? How would you do that? Or do I need to hard code accessing the cloud provider API to be able to access those resources?
So let me rephrase it just to see whether I got it. You might want to either do something in a resource that already exists, like a database inside of the server, or in some other cases, maybe even take over control of that server, which you created manually, let's say, and then use it through Crossplane, right?
Two different options, two different use cases. Yes, both of them might be relevant.
Yes.
Do we have a good solution for that?
I mean, good depends on a provider in a lot of. So let's say that we are using Google right now. I'll explain why I'm saying that in a second. So if I would now, let's say that I have a database, PostgreSQL database running in Google. If I would just apply now Crossplane resource and say, I want to have a database that happens to be exactly the same as that database. Crossplane never doesn't keep internal state like other tools. It always goes to the API of that something and say, look, this is what I want. Tell me what you have. And if you don't have it, I will create it. If you have it, I will do nothing if it's the same. Or if you have it and it's slightly different, then I will update it, right? So if I now create something here and that something already exists in AWS or Google, wherever, Crossplane would just take over control of that something, right? That would be for the second case. There is a problem with that. I'll get to that in a second.
But that requires that you kind of have the unique identifier of that thing.
And that's
matched
where
up correctly.
That's where
right?
AWS and other providers differ greatly. So let me show you an example. Get managed. Let's say VPC. Get VPCs. There we go. I think I have one. There we go. I have one here. Now, in this VPC that I created, let me find a metadata name. I'm calling it MyDB, right? But in AWS, there are not all. Some resources that cannot be named. They're like Voldemort.
Yeah, true.
That AWS will assign the name or ID automatically. And Crossplane deals with that by having this annotation external name. So this is the auto-generated ID of that service. In some cases, in many cases, that's exactly the same as the name you gave it, right? In many cases, it would be MyDB, but in case of VPC, specifically this, right? And so when Crossplane went there and created it, it got that ID back from AWS and injected this annotation into itself, right? If I would now imagine that that VPC was created already without Crossplane, if I would apply this YAML without annotations that were auto-injected, Crossplane would create a second one because it would says there is nothing called MyDB, doesn't exist. But if you want to take control of it or reference it, you can add this annotation yourself. So if in your YAML you would add this annotation, this is now at runtime, right? Your YAML normally don't have those annotations. If you add it there yourself, then it would, the Crossplane would say, okay, there is VPC with that name, nothing for me to do. Or maybe something if you change the region or whatever it is. Right?
Yeah. Well, or maybe it would be adjusting some of the parameters that are part of that VPC, right? But that's okay. That's a great thing because with that I can kind of import any resource that I have. Obviously that means that I kind of need to have a composition or a claim that represents the current state of that, right? So my next question would be then.
Let me show you. Here's an example. I think I have an example of AWS VPC. Here we go, right? So this is a VPC that I would normally define, right?
But my next question was going to be, I want to export from AWS kind of the claim. So let's look at, so what I'm thinking of is CloudFormation has a possibility nowadays to export infrastructure as code, right? And now I want to take over the VPC. That means I need to have all of the configurations in the same way that they are currently in AWS. Otherwise, Crossplane is just going to change them to something that might not be accurate, right?
So you can create resources in observe-only mode. So I could create this VPC. I don't remember from the top of my head the syntax. I would check in observe mode, and let's say that I would give it just a name, VPC, and nothing else, right? And since it's only observe mode, as long as there is a, sorry, not the name, the external name, right? So that Crossplane knows how to find it. The output would be similar to this. It would go there and find all the parameters, everything, right? So it's not kind of automated. It wouldn't give you the YAML, but you would need to output to YAML afterwards to get the...
Yeah, got it. But essentially, I wouldn't need that if I can just put it in observe mode, because with that, I can refer to the VPC in Crossplane compositions and others, but I do not I avoid changing things that I don't
it
want to be
depends
changed.
what the goal is.
Right?
If the goal is to reference it for something else, yes. If the goal is to take control of it, so tomorrow you update it somehow through Crossplane, then you would need to take that YAML and apply it.
Cool. Great. So, last but not least, let's talk a little bit about secrets. How do we do secrets in Crossplane? How do we access them? How do we potentially use external secret stores or not? What's the approach for that today?
Yeah. So can I do I assume right that you mean secrets for the resources you're creating with Crossplane?
Could be anything, yes.
So
But let's go with a database password,
so
whatever. Right?
if I do secrets here, you can see here my DB, and that's the secret that was generated. By the way, listeners, people who are watching, I will delete the database. Don't even try. So this is the secret that was generated when I created the database, right? And you're in control. You can choose the format of that secret and so on and so forth, right? And now my applications running in this cluster could use this secret to connect to the database, right? And I might have a policy that allows some applications and don't allow others and so on and so forth. Now, there is a very often case that, hey, I'm generating the secret here because this is where Crossplane is running, but my application might be running something somewhere completely different, maybe different cluster, right? And this is where that conversation about interoperability of most Kubernetes native applications comes in. If that would be the case, I would probably have external secrets operator available in this cluster. I didn't install it today. That would push this secret to AWS secret store. And then another secret in the other cluster, I would have a definition that would pull it from there, right? So
that reads from that
kind of
secret
Crossplane
manager.
creates it, and then you push it with external secrets operator. I mean, at least that's my choice, to wherever you want it and pull it wherever you want it.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So kind of using the Kubernetes ways of storing secrets and retrieving secrets, that's the best approach for doing that as well. Okay, cool. Then let's wrap up our demo, at least the part that we have planned, and let's dive a little bit. Well, let's not dive. What can we give the audience as a takeaway for this, Victor? I have two questions for you. First one is, if you use Terraform today, why the hell should you now move to Crossplane? What's the pitch that we're putting in here?
I don't feel fully comfortable. I don't like kind of like much talking about, hey, this Crossplane is better than this, but you asked for it. So
let's try to put it in a way like, if I'm a frequent Terraform user, if I want to start looking at Crossplane, what would be my steps to get there? Maybe that makes it a little bit
to get there,
less difficult.
I mean, first, don't do what Andreas did. That's the first step. Don't jump into Crossplane today. We are trying to change that in the future, what I touched upon earlier. But don't jump into Crossplane. Jump into Kubernetes first, right? Because once you're familiar and once you're confident with your with Kubernetes, then most of the things in Crossplane just make sense. Kind of learning curve for Crossplane can be extremely steep or extremely shallow, depending on how familiar you are with Kubernetes, right? Because much of the logic is the same, and so on and so forth.
Okay, so that means the person's coming from Terraform and cloud provider, just go and watch the video that I recorded with Carlos 3 months ago, right? Which is kind of that starting point on how do you get into Kubernetes. And also you have a bunch of videos that give people an introduction.
And I could say the same thing, to be honest, with many other things, kind of how do you get started with Prometheus for observability and so on and so forth, right? Kubernetes is tough, really tough. But it's very rewarding, since once you figure out Kubernetes, really how it works, then actually you did 90% of the work for most of the other tools. If you're using Jenkins, you need to learn Jenkins, right? If you use something on top of Kubernetes, you just need to learn a bit of it, not much.
Yeah, that's true. So that means you kind of first dive into Kubernetes and understanding how that works under the hood, how reconciliation works, how applying Kubernetes API changes works. Uh, when you're done with that, what would be your second step?
I mean, once you're done with that, then you start adopting tools, and you start realizing how much you want them, need them, depend on them, depending on how you define it. And then you start seeing real benefits, right? Because you will, let's say this hypothetical scenario, outside of core Kubernetes, the first thing that you might adopt could be Argo CD, right? And initially it's going to be, oh, what the heck, why? And, but then after some months, you will start oh no, yeah, this is the thing. Now I get it. Now I understand, right? And then Crossplane, and I'm now inventing a scenario, right? There are many different paths, and then you might say, okay, I want Argo CD, and I want it for everything. This is so awesome, right? And then you start thinking, okay, how can I do policies? Maybe Caverno, right? Because it's, again, Kubernetes native. How do I manage my infrastructure or applications? Crossplane, right? And all the things start fitting into the puzzle. Basically, imagine Kubernetes, if it would be a puzzle, Kubernetes would be the whole border, kind of like, right? You still don't see the
Yeah,
picture,
makes
but then
sense.
everything
Makes
starts
sense. Yeah,
fitting immediately, right?
yeah.
And that's one of the main reasons why. So there are many reasons why people are adopting Crossplane. One of them is simply that it's Kubernetes native, and they want something that feels at home for them, and home being Kubernetes, right? Another big thing is
But
APIs. So imagine that you're using AWS, right? Now imagine if AWS would give you a bunch of scripts or stuff like that to say, hey, this is how you manage EC2. You would say, no, I'm going to Azure. They give you API. That's API. APIs are always the cornerstone of every good service. Now, you would be fine with scripts. And when I say scripts, I put Terraform into that kind of client-side execution of something, if it's for you. But if you want to provide it as a service to others, then you want to give them an API, right, to interact with.
yep.
And then there are all the other goodies like drift detection, reconciliation, and so on and so forth.
Okay, but it still sounds like Crossplane is rather at the end of the learning curve, right? Than at the starting point, if I understand
Not
that
necessarily
correctly.
at the end of the learning curve, because there's still eBPF that is tougher. But let's say that I would recommend people who are confident with Kubernetes to jump into Crossplane. Now, whether it's going to be order of Crossplane, Caverno, and Argo CD, or Argo CD, Caverno, Crossplane, or whatever the tools are chosen, that would be a separate conversation. But same thing for many other tools. Kubernetes, it would be like, say, whatever in the past, and still, right? Kind of, if when somebody would ask me, hey, I want to do this or that, my answer was always the same: learn Linux first. If you don't know
Makes
Linux,
sense.
kind
Yeah,
of don't bother with pipelines. Kind of like, don't.
yeah. That is true. That is true. Okay, now last question, and then I'll kind
Sure.
of let you go. We all know that people in HR like to write job descriptions, and what they are good at is pointing out that you need to have 15 years of Kubernetes experience to apply for this role, and you need 25 years of Crossplane experience to apply for this role. How do you become that person, even though Crossplane is not 15 years old or
No.
25 years old, right? What is your take on getting people into being a Crossplane expert just like you? What do you recommend them?
I think the answer is the same. If I would be hiring somebody to be Crossplane service provider, whatever the role would be, I would be much more concerned about two things. First is Kubernetes itself, and second, familiarity with the endpoint. So I think it's, if you're familiar with Kubernetes, the real obstacle to adopting Crossplane will be, let's say that your company is using AWS. AWS is the real obstacle. I mean, it's not an obstacle. That's the wrong word, but required knowledge, right?
Okay.
What you really define with, so from that perspective, Crossplane is not that different from Terraform, Ansible, whatever you're using. Most of the time you spend is defining dozens and dozens and dozens of parameters for different services that in AWS, right?
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so that really means people just need to start using it and need to learn experimenting with
Yeah.
it, right? And for me, I attended my first KubeCon earlier this year in Paris. Something that I kind of took away with is that if you want to be successful with adopting any of the CNCF tools, you need to become part of the community. And for Crossplane being open source, this actually means becoming a person that engages with the community. What is your best? What is your guidance on how people can start that?
Probably the best destination is usually Slack. Crossplane has a Slack channel. Almost all projects, at least in CNCF, I'm saying CNCF because that's what I'm following more than others. They have a Slack channel, and that's a good start, right? And from there on, it would be nice for people to start contributing with pull requests. I always recommend things that nobody wants to do, and that's documentation, simply because it kind of forces you to get deeper into it, before you jump into code. Or some people never do that, right? And that's perfectly fine. But start with talking to people, and that's Slack.
Great, cool, thank you. So, Victor, any final question for me, maybe that you have?
Did I manage to just make you slightly less afraid of it or unconvinced?
Yes, you made me understand things. Still, it's like trusting a Gen AI tool to answer all of my questions, right? You give away responsibility, and giving away responsibility always means that there is some anxiety, you're a little bit anxious because of that. And I think gaining trust only happens if you really use the tool and if you provision infrastructure using it or provision applications using it. And it's going to take me a few more months to get that trust, right? That it works. But something that happened like 2 weeks ago was someone from the team deleted an RDS claim, and the RDS instance was being deprovisioned and stuff like that. There was luckily no kind of real data on it, but we put in the claim directly again, and Crossplane was able to save the state from a backup that was already there. So that is where I kind of really got some trust in. Yes, this really works if you use it right. And I think I'm on a good way towards trusting Crossplane to be one of the tools that I'm going to use and add to my stack
That
going
makes
forward.
sense. That's like with girlfriends and boyfriends. You don't marry the first day you meet. Spend some
That
time
is true.
together first.
Yeah, and get experiences with
Exactly.
it, right? And take learnings. And I think it's important to make your own mistakes, right? So that means I would encourage listeners to have a look on trying out to use Crossplane as an infrastructure provisioning tool for you at the end, or application provisioning tool, because Crossplane can be way more than just providing RDS instances or S3, right? If you do that right, you can really abstract away a lot of the underlying details for your end users. And that's when we then start talking about how Crossplane enables platform engineering. And I think you have at least one video on that on your YouTube, and we can link that in the show notes as well. Victor, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
People might want to have questions for you. What's your preferred approach these
Anything
days?
goes. I'm LinkedIn,
You're everywhere.
X, or Twitter, email. If you want, I also give my calendar a link to everybody. So if you want to speak in person, that's fine as well. I want to
Cool.
be. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much for spending the time to help me educate others. And hoping to do some more stuff with you and keep learning from the cool stuff that you do. Thank
Thank
you
you
so
for
much,
having
Victor.
me.
Bye bye.